Hello and welcome to Diamond Select Toys channel. Today we're going to be talking to sculptor Jean St. and designer Nelson Asencio about their work on a new sub-series of Marvel Gallery Dioramas. We're going to start off with Jean St. We're going to ask him, Jean, what is it you like best about working with Nelson's designs?
He chooses things that I wouldn't automatically jump to. So I kind of like that, because the normal formula stuff that I might lean towards, like stylistically, I really like some of the 70s guys like Gene Colan and Neil Adams and Jim Aparo, stuff like that. So a lot of times I'll lean toward like a thinner body type, longer body type, muscular, like that. And he goes sometimes for a little more stocky body type, which makes me think things through a little differently. But yeah, so I think we've come up with a lot of interesting stuff, because we've worked on a lot of projects outside of this together too. Like I think didn't we do some premiere stuff too? Did you draw
Yeah,
some premiere stuff
I,
maybe?
I did. We did the Gamora piece as well together,
That's right. Yeah.
and
So we've done a lot of stuff together, so it's cool. Like I kind of know what to expect in a way when he starts doing thumbnail sketches. And then generally he'll do, we usually do like 4 or 5 thumbnails, and then me and Chuck look at them. Then all three of us kick them around, throw some ideas in there, and then come up with what the final's going to be that he's going to draw out for
yeah,
Marvel. And along the way, we discuss like, usually we figure out like how much base we want so that we can limit the amount of plastic, how a figure's going to be supported if they're like leaping or flying or something like that. And so we go from an aesthetic sense through like what production issues we can think through, so that they're not going to, so that the piece is going to be best represented at the end as well. But yeah, so it's been a good relationship working back and forth between me, him, and Chuck.
Nelson, when you do incorporate a lot of movement and energy into a lot of your designs, do you try to rein yourself in when you're doing the designs, thinking about production, or do you pretty much just let the design go where it's going to go?
well, yeah, I pretty much just design it. Let the design go where it wants to go, and then like Chuck pulls me back. It's like, oh, that's a little too much. But of course, I kind of try to think about that. Obviously, being like pieces like with gallery, where you have a set price point, where obviously you want the basis to be smaller, or the material that's being used. So I kind of think of that as well. And but for most of it, I really would I like to try to get it in a pose, like again, like freezing that moment in time, or an iconic pose depending on the character, and try to capture that within the drawing. And for me, I think it's also important, as I'm like doing these little roughs and sketches. Like I know some of them will be more extreme than others. So like to Gene's point, I know that sometimes you'll take something from one, or say, can you put this and that, and go back and forth. Bring maybe do an amalgamation of two designs. So I always hope that they go for the more extravagant one, but sometimes it depends, obviously, of cost and all that. So yeah. So for the most part, I try to go as exaggerate the pose as much as possible, or bring as much action. Big influence for me growing up, or with comics and stuff, has been like anime. And so I've always loved the anime statues that are out there, and they always seem to show a lot of energy, and it's very dynamic. These dynamic poses in their designs and their statues. So that's what I try to bring on my end, when I'm doing these sketches. So that's
Yes, what ended up being really tricky too is when, from the beginning, we were sort of thinking out maybe a dozen or so characters and what we were going to do.
yeah.
And when you start thinking that deep, you really got to think about, well, how do you vary up the battle poses? You can't have everybody leaping the same way or running the same way. Certain type of effects are hard to produce in plastic, like if you have somebody coming too high off the base or whatever. So you really have to start looking at a few of them in a row and figuring out, which bases are going to complement each other and which poses. Because the idea was that with the concept of the line really is that you could take any of these statues and face them off against each other and create this battle dynamic between the different characters. But you also need, the pose has to, there was kind of three things that I thought of when we were first talking about it, was that you want to have a nice standalone statue that represents the character. Try to weave a little bit of something into the base that's iconic for the character. Like with Cap, on his base, we have it's like he blew through a Hydra lab.
Yeah.
So it's a piece of, strange machinery on the ground, and there's a Hydra logo on the floor. And with some of the other guys, I think like with Wolverine. It's like he blew through a Weapon X laboratory or something. So there's that type of stuff on the ground. So we try to add elements that if you look at the base, you can see something that has to do with the character. On top of it, the base can not exactly puzzle piece into another base, because you don't want to have these interlocking things that locks you into one thing. But at the same time, if you take like Wolverine and you face him off against Iron Man, then they're still going to look like there's a relationship between the eye levels, so that as you put these guys together, you can kind of create battle dynamics between villains, between heroes. Because ideally what we're going for is this like apocalyptic scenario where all the villains, all the heroes are in this massive battle. Like how in the comics sometimes you get kind of a rivalry between like the X-Men and the Avengers, or these different teams, or so you can set up any of those scenarios without being locked into it. So like Cap is going to look cool by himself as a standalone, or you can pair him up with someone. And so that was kind of the idea, and making all that stuff work, and at the same time trying not to reproduce the same pose a couple of times. And at the same time, it's like, okay, if one guy's moving in a certain direction, like to the right, but you have a hero like Captain America or Thor where you really want them wielding their weapon with their right hand, usually, unless you're a left-handed sculptor or painter, you might paint them the other way. So there's kind of a bunch of different things to think of that you have to all make sense, which probably no one cares about but us, but someone has to think about it.
Yeah, and it's like being in the city, like Gene was saying, like with Spidey, I would like to take shots of, things like backgrounds, like the lamppost that he's on, and the entrance to a subway. The same thing with the Wasp as well, taking these elements that kind of link everything together within the debris. And as doing the 2D art, that was what was challenging, which I knew that at the end it would be Gene that would have to figure out how these pieces will relate. Because in my 2D drawings, I'm like, okay, how do we make this work where, like Gene was saying, they can work with each other as well, but not necessarily link up. And I believe at the beginning I did try to think of like something that was a little bit more of a puzzle piece, but that wasn't really what we wanted, and which makes complete sense. That's the challenging part when I'm doing the 2D work, is hopefully there's enough there to help Gene when he goes to 3D, especially being that Gene is a traditional sculptor. I think it would be a bit easier since you actually have the objects there, right? That you can play around and kind of see how they all work together. Would that be something that makes sense, Gene, as opposed to, like, let's say, a digital sculptor?
I always tend to think it's probably a little easier to deal with stuff like that in a physical plane.
Mhm.
Also, on top of that, figuring out the balance points of all these things, because all of the characters in their dioramas are either supported in the air or they're running off of one foot, and they're things that have to be balanced properly, or they're just going to flip over in production.
Mhm.
Because the other
Mhm.
thing too, when you're doing it in a physical plane or whether you're doing it digitally, you're not necessarily going to have the same amount of weight in your base. When they do a PVC statue and they hollow out that main part of the base, that's going to be like an ABS shell with a cap on the bottom.
Right.
So when I'm doing this and I know my final piece is going to be resin, I might have a 1 pound chunk of resin holding this thing flat on the ground. Whereas if it's too off balance when they do that in production, I'm not going to have that weight to hold it down. So you have to get your center of gravity balanced by the way the character relates to the angle of the base rather than just the weight of the actual material, because the figure is actually going to weigh more than the base a lot of times
Mhm.
because of that big hollow shell. So it's a big part of this is figuring out production wise how we sell it, because if Cap's kind of flying through the air, but a month after you put it on your shelf his leg starts to wilt because the PVC is too soft, it's just not going to look good. You lose your whole effect and you have a kind of a crappy product, but it's been one of the exciting things about the project is I think we've been able to capture the energy. Like there's parts, like even especially in the Captain America, where there's exploding bits that are actually attached to different parts of like his shoes and stuff. So it looks like stuff's kicking up from the ground as he's running. And every one of the dioramas has some sort of energy or moving smoke or debris or water, so that there's a lot of elemental organic stuff going on that offsets the momentum of the character and supports the idea. And then all of these unique architectural elements. And like Nelson was saying, because he's in the city and a lot of Marvel is set in the city, we can kind of capture those things, like he was saying, when he was drawing Spider-Man, we went back and forth looking at all this stuff he had photographed, subway stations. So he would be sitting on top of one of these big brass kind of
Mhm.
sphere and pole kind of things at the entrance to a station. And so it's a cool line. I mean, it's not like it's not stuff we haven't done before, but in this line specifically, every one of them has to have that element. How do you capture that motion that's in the drawing and then create it in a way that we can afford to make it in a statue, So it's been cool. I mean, up to this point, I think we've done a pretty decent job of conveying that with all the statues. And I think they still haven't shown all of them, but, I think the direction's pretty consistent in the line so far.
Yeah, we've shown a bunch at shows. We solicited Captain America and Wolverine, and we're about to solicit the Wasp, I believe. But there's also still Thor and Iron Man and Vision. We just solicited as well. We've seen a bunch of them, including a lot that haven't been offered yet. But I certainly can't wait to see more villains. Are we going to see more villains in the line?
Yeah, I'm working on a villain right now that we just got approved last week. So I'm literally in the embryonic stages. So I've just roughed out all the anatomy.
That's
But
great.
yeah, the other thing is too with this is like, which villains do you pick when this is like a giant, allegedly, theoretically a giant war? Like what villains are worthy, you know what I mean, to throw into this battle that would elicit the response of like every Marvel superhero team and individual vigilante and stuff like that. Who do you throw at them, So that's been kind of an interesting challenge. But yeah, I think it'd be cool as more and more of the stuff is shown.
Nelson, you mentioned that you were influenced by a lot of anime. Do you have any other artists specifically that you look to for inspiration?
Yeah, I've obviously there's so many artists that we admire. I mean, Frazetta was always a big influence. like from anime, obviously like Otomo. I love Takeya's work and Terada. There's so a lot of Japanese artists that I love. Nirasawa, it was amazing. His work is just phenomenal. Um, and just recently more of the like Art Adams, just to think of the comic book guys out there. George Perez. So yeah, it's just I guess it makes a different influences for me. And especially being that when I was at Art Asylum, seeing the process, learning, being there with the artists and the sculptors and painters, it actually gave me a chance to kind of think three-dimensionally, which is what I try to do when I do when I do my designs. I try to think of them that way. And like pieces that Nirasawa did and Terada, I mean Takeya. Well, Terada also sculpts, I believe. Those were really just amazing for me, and I just love their work as well. You know.
Gene, as a traditional sculptor, do you find the use of movement and the energy effects that Nelson brings to his designs, do you find those to be an additional challenge, or are those the same for you as sculpting, say, a static, posed character?
They are more of a challenge because sculpturally you have to figure out, well, how do you represent smoke or fire and make them look convincing? And part of the effect is that I'll cast this stuff in a clear material and use some tinting so that if those type of elements, or like water, if they can conduct light, you can make a more convincing natural element in a diorama. But a lot of times you have to stylize it so that, like whether you read comic books or not, you have to figure out how do you represent something in a sculpture, in a static piece. Like the interesting things about fire and smoke and water is that they're always moving and
Yeah.
changing. So you have to convey that energy, that kinetic energy, into a static form. So like I said, part of it is with light, materials in the final that'll conduct light. But what I end up doing a lot of times, I mean, you can kind of look at comics, but doesn't help that much always. So what I'll do is go back to old world stuff, see the way that guys that sculpted in cathedrals and stuff, like Michelangelo and Bernini, how would they represent smoke and things of that nature, and then take that stylized approach and maybe try to figure out a way that I could bring something to it a little differently. And all the while thinking about, okay, if I do it this way, how much texture is appropriate? Like if I do fire and I put a lot of lines in it, it's not going to look like fire, it's going to look like hair. So in a way, being somebody that gets wrapped up in detail, there's certain things that kind of a minimalistic approach is your friend, especially with like water. You have to really get things very smooth, have a minimum of momentum lines in it. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like water, even if you add a clear effect. So that ends up being one of the trickier things. And also making pieces delicate. Like if you have splashes of water, or like in the wasp statue, there Nelson drew all these little curls of smoke coming up around her leg and stuff. And we had she has like a energy kind of thing going on around her hand. So with that, I actually turned a sphere, a hollow sphere, and then put energy spikes coming off of it, and then did it all clear. And I had to two-piece this little egg kind of thing around her hand to encapsulate it, to create it. That was really tricky to do, to make it work. And then all little delicate pieces, when initially when I do it, it's a pain. But when I have to send it to the factory and explain to those guys, all the stuff I send them has to fit together exactly and be supported with photos. so that they don't just get a bag of parts and say, well, what do we do with these?
Right.
So yeah, I'd say that's got to be the trickiest part of the thing, is conveying all the energy and natural element stuff. But it also adds so much to it. Once you put clear pieces on a base, conveying that stuff. Like if you look at all the stuff that Nelson drew for, is it Mortal Kombat or that other? I think it's Mortal Kombat.
Mortal
Guy
Kombat.
with
Yeah.
ice and stuff, the Mr. Freeze kind of guy.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the game or whatever, but that stuff works so well because those elements are so striking, so
Yeah. There's Sub-Zero.
yeah, Sub-Zero. Yeah, I love all that stuff. It's tricky to do, but it's so worth it at the end when you see the result, because the contrary to that, whenever you see someone try to do an action figure or a statue and they don't do clear pieces, or they sculpt fire to look like hair, it just looks off. It just does not convey it. It looks so kindergarten, So yeah, it's challenging, but it's a lot of fun. It's worth it. If you nail it at the end and the factory gets it right, it's very satisfying to see it done well.
Hey, Gene, do you find it certain materials easier to sculpt like the fire? Like, do you find that you use just castelline to sculpt everything, or other materials?
Sometimes what I've done on certain things, like I do a lot of symbiote stuff for the action figure line for Select. And what I found is really cool is I'll make like a very fine wire armature for all of those tendrils. And I've been using hot melt glue and running it down the wires, so you get all those snot-like looking stretches and everything.
Yeah.
It works really good. And you can kind of do that with, you can do it with stuff like water too. Just sculpt the main form and then let some hot melt glue run down the sides, and you can get all sorts of different stuff. And so I use a lot of different things. I think that's the aspect that I'll miss the most when eventually I'll be switching to digital. I have all this stuff, just a pain to learn, but I'll miss the multitude of materials, because I build stuff out of wood. I'll do things with plaster. Like on some of our bases, I'll cast a big plaster block and then I'll smash it with a hammer and use that debris on my sculpted base and glue it all in, so that you get an effect like concrete, and put in pieces of mesh sometimes so that it looks like the mesh in an old plaster and lathing house, and pieces of wire for rebar and stuff like that. I mean, there's so many cool things you can do. And in addition to just, sculpting that stuff, so if I'm a little lost, sometimes I'll do collage stuff like that to get a new feel into different bases. And then each time I hit another base, I find, oh, I liked that from this base and this from this one. Or sometimes I'll just be like, all right, I'm not going to use any of that stuff this time. I'm just going to sculpt everything. So I'll usually use predominantly castelline, or do really smooth pieces in wax. But I kind of just use whatever kind of strikes me. I've done some things where I've done bases and all the smoke in like monster clay, and then used other stuff for different things. I just kind of, because one of the things that inspires me is just using different stuff,
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm going to do like the one I'm working on now. I usually don't use monster clay a lot because it's kind of soft, but you can work really fast and loose. So I'm doing the whole rough out monster clay, and I'm going to lay on all the armor with sheet wax and then recast it into a harder material so I can do some finishing on it, which is pretty much what I did with Gamora on the premiere statue. So, it depends on the project. There's different things I do. If I'm struck at a certain moment, be like, oh, it'd be cool to work in for this, And then also with the stuff we've been doing, there's tons of fabrication. So I have to do a lot of turns on the lathe and on the mill, like for Iron Man with the boots and gloves we did for him from that retro armor, and repulsor things on his chest and gloves and all that. Cap's shield is always a lot of fun to do on the lathe. And so there's always a lot of that stuff too. You know, it's about getting that contrast between organics and mechanical stuff.
Nelson, you've done a lot of work for you both have done a lot of work for Diamond Select. Do you have a favorite piece that jumps out at you, either in recent memory or in the history of working with us?
Yeah, a few pieces. I love the way the Doctor Strange came out. I think it was a premiere piece. Actually, I like both of them, the gallery and the premiere piece. Those pieces came out pretty cool. I love the Iron Spidey that we did a few years, like 2 years ago, I believe, around there. Um, I'm really loving what Gene's done with this line. The Spidey, I think it looks so amazing. No pun intended there, right? But it came out really cool the way, you know, because I was always afraid of, again, like when you do a drawing, right? It's 2D, so you know you're thinking of these things, but how it's gonna come out in 3D and stuff. But Gene then to solve those challenges of how he's gonna balance it out, like he was just saying earlier. Um, it's pretty cool to see it come to life, you know, from the 2D drawing to a 3D piece. And the vision, I think, looks amazing, and Wasp, actually, they all look amazing. The those pieces look dope. And I do like what the Mortal Kombat stuff, the way those pieces are coming out, look pretty cool. And the Bruce Lee pieces look pretty cool too. So I guess there's more than one. A lot of cool stuff, and it's always great. What's great about working in this industry is like getting this chance to work on all these different properties that we all kind of grew up with. You know, and you know, even like the stuff that I'm working on now, which I can't obviously talk about, but I'm just like, wow, this is so cool to have this opportunity to work on these things. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff from Diamond that I'm happy that I've been able to partake in, and I'm still like you know, floored by it, by the whole experience. You know, and to get to work with other artists such as Gene and you know Dave Cortez and in the past, you know, like Paul Komoda and all these amazing sculptors. Uh, to me that's like the reward as well to see like these pieces come to life from my 2D drawings. So.
Gene, how about you? Do you see pieces that you are particularly proud of?
Yeah, I think if I had to pick one out of everything I've done for Diamond over like the last 15 years, it'd be my Tomb of Dracula statue from the original Milestones line, because that Gene Colan's always one of my favorite artists since I was a kid, and that was like my favorite comic. And but in terms of more modern stuff, I was really psyched to work on Winter Soldier for the Select line because I always liked the character. And when I was doing the research dive to put together material for the figure, I found that Lee Bermeo, who's my favorite modern artist, I've done probably, I think I did like 6 or 7 statues with him for DC Direct. And he had done a bunch of Winter Soldier covers. So I pulled all the covers and used him as the reference for the Winter Soldier. And then one of the other favorite things I did in terms of superheroes more recently was the Sam Wilson Cap, because I love the way when I was a kid, the Captain America book that I read was Captain America and Falcon. That's what it was at the time in the 70s. So I've always wanted to do something with the Falcon. And when they showed him in that version of the costume, I was just blown away. So it was awesome to work on that. And then, of course, I worked on all the Universal Monsters stuff. And Batman 66 was a dream project because I was like 1 year old when that came on TV, and I was obsessed with Batman since I saw that show. So I think I did about 30 pieces for that line. It was like 25, 30 pieces for that line. So hard to pick one or two things, but because there's been so many high points for me as far as what I love to do. But if I had to pick one, it would be Tomb of Dracula.
That's great. Hopefully we can keep you guys working on projects that you love and properties that you love for the foreseeable future. Because we're at the office, we're big fans of both of your work, obviously. So thank you guys for doing this. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon about your next project you're working on with us.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Zach.
Definitely.
Nice talking to you.